The last thing Daniel said to Evelyn before he walked out of that hospital room was not, "I love you." It wasn't even, "I'm sorry." It was, "Don't worry, the insurance will handle everything. My lawyer will contact you." And then he left. No hesitation, no glance back, just the quiet click of a door closing on a marriage that had lasted 18 years. Evelyn Carter, a woman who had built a multi-million-dollar investment empire from the ground up, lay there unable to move her legs, staring at a ceiling that offered her nothing. And in that moment she did not cry. She made a decision so precise and so calculated that in just 31 days it would dismantle everything Daniel thought he had secured. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Evelyn Carter was not the kind of woman people immediately recognized as powerful, and that had always worked in her favor. She spoke calmly, never rushed her words, and rarely repeated herself, which meant that when she did say something, people listened whether they realized it or not. Over 2 decades, she had quietly built Carter Strategic Holdings into a firm that managed assets most people would only ever read about in financial publications. She understood risk in a way that made others uncomfortable, not because she took wild chances, but because she eliminated uncertainty before anyone else even noticed it existed. Daniel Carter, her husband, had entered her life when she was already successful, but still expanding, still refining the systems that would later make her nearly untouchable in business circles. He had charm, ambition, and just enough vision to recognize opportunity when it stood in front of him, but not enough discipline to sustain it without help. Evelyn had seen that immediately, and instead of turning away, she chose to invest in him the same way she invested in everything else she believed had potential. She introduced him to investors who trusted her judgment more than his presentation. She quietly redirected funds when his first company struggled, restructuring its operations through her own team while allowing him to remain the public face of its recovery. At industry events, people would congratulate Daniel on his resilience, his leadership, his growth, and Evelyn would stand beside him, composed and supportive, never correcting the narrative, never claiming credit. She told herself that this was what partnership looked like, that success shared quietly was still success, and that loyalty, once given, would be returned in equal measure. For years, that belief held steady, reinforced by routine, by appearances, by the comfortable illusion of stability that often surrounds long marriages. But stability, as Evelyn understood better than most, is not always a reflection of strength. Sometimes it is simply the absence of visible cracks. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning, just after 9, in a parking structure she had used for over a decade. The concrete was damp from overnight rain, the kind that left surfaces slick but not obviously dangerous. Evelyn approached her car as she always did, scanning without appearing to, noting the position of nearby vehicles, the faint echo of footsteps in the distance, the rhythm of an environment she had long ago learned to read instinctively. She unlocked the door, settled into the driver's seat, and started the engine. There was nothing unusual in the sound, nothing in the feel of the steering wheel or the responsiveness of the pedals that suggested anything was wrong. It wasn't until she began descending the curved ramp toward the exit that something changed. She pressed the brake and felt resistance give way too easily beneath her foot. The car did not slow the way it should have. For a fraction of a second, her mind calculated distance, speed, angle, and outcome. And then the vehicle lurched forward, momentum carrying it into a barrier that should have stopped it cleanly but instead crumpled under impact. When she regained consciousness, there were voices around her, controlled but urgent, professionals doing their work with practiced efficiency. Pain registered in fragments, sharp and distant at the same time, her body responding in ways she could not immediately control. Later in the hospital, a physician explained that she had suffered a spinal contusion. The language was careful, precise, designed to inform without alarming, but Evelyn heard the uncertainty beneath it. Recovery was possible, likely even, but not guaranteed in the timeframes people preferred to hear. Weeks, maybe months, they said, and she nodded as if this were simply another variable to manage. She did not mention that Daniel had used her car 2 days earlier, or that he was one of the few people with access to it that week. She did not question the initial assessment that labeled the brake failure as mechanical. She simply stored the information, placing it alongside everything else she had learned over the years about how things appear on the surface versus how they function underneath. Daniel arrived hours later, long after the surgery had been completed, long after the immediate crisis had passed. He was dressed as he usually was for business meetings, composed, deliberate, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to being received well in professional spaces. But he was not alone. The sound reached Evelyn before the sight did, the distinct rhythm of heels striking the hospital floor with measured certainty. Lauren Hayes entered beside him, her younger sister, someone Evelyn had helped raise in many ways after their parents passed, someone she had supported through school, through early career decisions, through moments of doubt that Lauren had once shared openly. Now she stood slightly behind Daniel, close enough to signal alignment, distant enough to maintain the appearance of independence. Daniel acknowledged Evelyn with a brief statement rather than a question, his tone suggesting inconvenience more than concern, and Lauren moved toward the window, her attention directed outward while her awareness remained entirely within the room. They spoke about the company within minutes, not about Evelyn's condition, not about her comfort, not about what she might need in the days ahead, but about timelines, responsibilities, and the practical implications of her absence. Daniel mentioned the upcoming acquisition, the expectations of the board, the necessity of leadership that could be physically present and visibly active. Evelyn corrected a detail he misstated, quietly, precisely, and for a moment he seemed unsettled by the reminder that she was still fully aware, still processing everything being said. But the conversation did not shift. It continued along the same path, one that positioned her as an obstacle to be managed rather than a partner to be supported. When they left, Lauren touched Evelyn's hand briefly, a gesture that might have been interpreted as comfort under different circumstances, but now felt ambiguous, difficult to categorize as genuine or performative. In the days that followed, Evelyn remained still outwardly while her mind moved with increasing clarity. She observed patterns, timing, small inconsistencies in behavior that, when viewed individually, meant very little, but when placed together formed something more structured. By the fourth day, she noticed how sound traveled through the room, how conversations in the corridor could be heard through the ventilation system above the door. She adjusted her routine accordingly, creating the impression of distraction at certain times, allowing others to assume she was occupied when she was, in fact, listening. On the ninth day, Daniel and Lauren stood just outside, their voices low but distinct enough to carry. They discussed the board meeting scheduled in a few weeks, the likelihood of Evelyn being declared unable to fulfill her role, the process by which an interim leader could be appointed. Daniel spoke with a level of certainty that suggested preparation rather than speculation, referencing conversations with specific board members, outlining steps that had already been set in motion. Lauren asked about the house, about legal provisions tied to Evelyn's condition, and Daniel responded with confidence, explaining that the agreements in place would allow for control to shift under certain circumstances. There was no hesitation in his voice, no sign that he considered this plan premature or uncertain. It was presented as something already secured, already moving toward completion. When they left, their footsteps fading down the corridor, Evelyn lay in silence, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady. What had been suspicion was now confirmation. This was not a situation developing in response to her accident. This was something that had been considered, structured, and was now being executed with the assumption that she would not interfere. That night, Evelyn reached for her phone and began a process she had not anticipated needing, but for which she was fully prepared. 18 months earlier, she had restructured her holdings, separating visible assets from those that held actual value, creating layers that required her direct authorization for any meaningful transfer of control. At the time, it had been a precaution, a decision influenced by experience rather than immediate threat. Now, it became the foundation of her response. She reviewed agreements, confirmed access points, and initiated a series of quiet adjustments that would not trigger immediate attention but would become critical at the right moment. She contacted her attorney not to react but to position. She did not disclose everything at once. She never did. Information, like capital, was most effective when deployed strategically. As days passed, Evelyn's physical condition began to improve, gradually at first, then with increasing consistency. By the third week, she could stand with support, take measured steps within the privacy of her room. She chose not to share this progress widely. During the day, she allowed the appearance of limitation to remain, moving carefully when observed, accepting assistance when offered. At night, she practiced walking, rebuilding strength in controlled increments, ensuring that when the time came, there would be no uncertainty in her movement. Meanwhile, her team worked discreetly, tracing financial activity connected to Daniel's recent ventures, identifying links that connected his external dealings back to entities that, through layered structures, ultimately answered to her. She did not act on these findings immediately. She waited, allowing events to progress to a point where intervention would have maximum impact. On the morning of the 31st day, Evelyn made a single call, confirming arrangements that had been prepared in advance. The board meeting was scheduled for early afternoon, and by the time it began, Daniel had already positioned himself as the natural successor to her role, presenting continuity, stability, and readiness. He spoke with assurance, referencing her condition in terms that suggested finality rather than recovery, framing his involvement as both necessary and inevitable. The board listened, some in agreement, others uncertain, but none fully aware of how incomplete the picture they had been given truly was. As he prepared to formalize his position, the doors to the room opened, and Evelyn entered, not as someone returning unexpectedly, but as someone who had never relinquished her place. Her presence shifted the room immediately. Conversation stopped, attention redirected, assumptions interrupted. She acknowledged the board first, her tone measured, her demeanor unchanged from the years they had known her, and then she addressed the matter at hand with clarity. The acquisition Daniel intended to finalize required her authorization, a detail embedded within agreements that had been in place long before the current situation. Documentation was distributed, outlining provisions that had not been considered in his planning. She then introduced a second matter, one involving financial irregularities that had been documented over the preceding weeks, supported by evidence that had already been submitted to the appropriate authorities. She did not raise her voice, did not extend the moment unnecessarily. She presented facts, allowed them to settle, and then moved forward. What followed was not dramatic in the way people often expect such moments to be. There were no outbursts, no visible confrontation beyond the shifting expressions around the table as understanding took hold. Daniel's position unraveled not through argument, but through the weight of information he had not anticipated. Decisions were made, processes initiated, and by the end of the day, the structure he had attempted to secure no longer existed in the form he had imagined. Evelyn remained composed throughout, engaging with each development as she would any other business matter, focused on resolution rather than reaction. In the days that followed, consequences extended beyond the boardroom. Financial arrangements connected to Daniel's ventures were reevaluated, obligations called in, partnerships reconsidered. The narrative he had built around his success began to shift as underlying details became visible in filings and reports that were, for a time, publicly accessible. He reached out once, attempting contact, but Evelyn did not respond. Her schedule had returned to its usual rhythm, filled with meetings, decisions, and forward movement. The hospital room, the accident. The weeks of observation and planning became part of a sequence that had led to a clear outcome. Evelyn did not remove the wheelchair that had been used during her recovery. It remained in a storage space within her office building, not as a symbol of limitation, but as a reminder of a period in which she had been assessed incorrectly by those closest to her. She understood something then that reinforced what she had learned over years of building and protecting what she had created. The most significant advantages are often not visible at the moment they are gained. They develop quietly, shaped by patience, by attention, and by the willingness to act only when action is most effective. Evelyn had not needed to react immediately. She had needed to understand completely, and once she did, the outcome followed with a level of certainty that required no further adjustment. Evelyn Carter was not just successful in the way people casually describe wealth. She was deliberate, disciplined, and deeply intentional about everything she built, and that made her different from most people in her world. She understood early that real influence did not require noise, and so she never chased recognition, never raised her voice to prove authority, and never corrected people when they underestimated her, because she had learned that being overlooked often created the perfect space to move without resistance. Daniel's first business had not started with his confidence alone. It had started with her capital, her planning, and her quiet intervention at moments when failure was only one decision away. When his company struggled under pressure he could not manage, it was Evelyn who stepped in behind the scenes, restructuring operations, redirecting resources, and stabilizing what he could not hold together on his own, all while allowing him to stand in front of others and take the credit as if it had always been his. She introduced him to investors who trusted her judgment, people who would later describe Daniel as self-made without ever realizing how much of his foundation had been carefully constructed by someone who chose not to be seen. And Evelyn never corrected them, not because she lacked the opportunity, but because she believed in him, believed in what they had built together, and believed that love meant giving without keeping score, even when the balance was quietly shifting in ways she had not yet fully measured. The crash didn't make sense, not to someone like Evelyn Carter, who had spent years understanding how systems worked, and more importantly, how they failed. Her car had been parked in the same structure she had used almost every day for over a decade, a place so familiar that even the smallest change would have stood out to her, yet nothing had seemed out of place when she approached it that morning. The engine responded normally, the steering felt steady in her hands, and for those first few seconds everything followed the predictable rhythm of routine, until she reached the curve she had taken hundreds of times before and pressed the brake, only to feel something give in a way it never should have. There was no resistance, no gradual slowing, just a sudden absence of control that turned a simple exit into a moment that would change everything. Later, when the explanations came, they were clean and convenient mechanical failure, an isolated issue, nothing intentional, nothing worth questioning further, but Evelyn did not repeat those conclusions or challenge them in the room. She simply listened, nodded when necessary, and stored one detail more carefully than the rest: the fact that Daniel had used her car 2 days before, a small piece of information that meant very little on its own but settled into place in her mind with a weight she did not ignore. When Daniel finally came to the hospital, hours after the surgery had ended and long after the urgency had passed, he did not come alone, and Evelyn knew that before she even turned her head because the sound reached her first, the distinct, measured rhythm of heels striking the floor with a confidence she recognized instantly. Lauren, her younger sister. The same woman she had helped through college when money had been tight and options had been limited. The same woman who used to sit across from her at the kitchen table and call her my hero, with a kind of sincerity that once felt unbreakable. Now she stood beside Daniel as if that history belonged to someone else entirely, close enough to him to suggest something unspoken yet obvious, her voice soft, almost light, carrying a quiet ease that did not belong in a hospital room. Daniel spoke as though he were addressing a situation rather than a person, his tone controlled, distant, focused on what came next instead of what had just happened. And Lauren let out a small laugh at something he said, a sound so ordinary and misplaced that it seemed to echo louder than it should have. Evelyn watched them both without interruption, her expression steady, her mind moving past the surface of what she was seeing and into something deeper, something far more complete than anger. Because in that moment, what settled over her was not emotion in the way most people would expect, but clarity, sharp and unmistakable, the kind that leaves no room for doubt and no need for explanation. Days later, when the hallway had settled into its quiet rhythm and visitors moved with the low, careful voices people use around the sick, Evelyn heard them again, not in the room this time but just outside it. Their words carried clearly through the vent positioned above her door, a detail she had noticed early and never ignored. She remained still, her breathing even, her presence easy to overlook from the other side, and listened as Lauren's voice came first, lowered but certain, saying she wouldn't recover in time, that the board would have no choice but to replace her. There was no hesitation in the way she said it, no trace of doubt, only expectation. Daniel answered without pause, his tone calm in a way that suggested preparation rather than speculation, explaining that when the decision was made, control would pass to him, that everything would fall into place exactly as it needed to. Everything. The word settled with weight as Evelyn repeated it silently in her mind, not because she misunderstood it, but because she understood it too well, her company, her home, the life she had spent years building piece by piece, now being discussed as if it were already his. She did not move, did not interrupt, did not react in any visible way, but something shifted completely in that moment, something that replaced uncertainty with precision, because what she was hearing was no longer something that could be explained away or dismissed as circumstance. This was not a sudden mistake or a moment of weakness. This was a plan, structured, deliberate, and already in motion. Something inside Evelyn changed. And it did not announce itself with emotion or visible reaction. It did not arrive with anger or grief in a way anyone around her could recognize. It simply settled into place with a quiet finality that left no space for hesitation. She lay there in the stillness of the room, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, but the way she was thinking had shifted entirely, moving away from what had happened and toward what would happen next. That night, when the hallway lights dimmed and the routine of the hospital slowed into silence, she reached for her phone with the same calm precision she brought to every major decision she had ever made, and she began to plan. Not impulsively, not emotionally, but with the same structured clarity that had built everything she owned. She reviewed timelines, reconsidered access points, and began connecting details that had previously seemed separate but now formed a pattern she could act on. While Daniel and Lauren moved through their days believing she was still recovering, still limited, still unaware of how far things had gone, Evelyn was constructing something they had not prepared for, something that did not rely on reaction or confrontation. She was not interested in revenge as they might have expected, because revenge was temporary and often careless. What she was building required patience, accuracy, and complete control, and once it was in place, there would be no part of their plan left untouched by it. If you have watched to this stage, click on the subscribe button to actually know what really happened to Daniel. And what do you think that will happen to him? We will see in the next video.